Good to see each one here this morning, and I invite you to open up your Bibles to the book of James, and that's where we'll be taking our lesson from this morning. If you're visiting with us, we especially appreciate your presence. We are looking at James for the second time in a series of lessons that will go throughout the year. Each first Sunday of the month, Marshall and I will be taking a section of the book of James. The first lesson was an introduction and kind of overview. You can find that on our website if you want to go back and kind of get the whole picture in mind. But we're really just beginning with the text, getting into a more detailed study this morning, and going to be looking at James chapter 1, verses 2 through 12. And so we invite you to study along with us this morning. We invite you to continue studying with us if you would like, as we continue not just to study James, but of course as we study God's Word every time we gather together. The book of James, chapter 1, opens up with very challenging words. Count it all joy, which is a very bright sort of a statement. But he says, consider it all joy, my brothers, when you encounter various trials. We'll just continue reading here on through verse 12. Knowing that the testing of your faith brings about perseverance. Let perseverance have its perfect work, so that you may be perfect and complete, lacking in nothing. But if any of you lacks wisdom, let him ask of God, who gives to all generously and without reproach, and it will be given to him. But he must ask in faith, doubting nothing, for the one who doubts is like the surf of the sea, driven and tossed by the wind. For that man ought not to expect that he will receive anything from the Lord, being a double-minded man, unstable in all his ways. But the brother of humble circumstances is to boast in his high position. The rich man is to boast in his humiliation, because like flowering grass he will pass away. For the sun rises with a scorching heat and withers the grass, and the flower falls off, and the beauty of its appearance is destroyed. So too the rich man in the midst of his pursuits will fade away. Blessed is a man who perseveres under trial, for once he has been approved, he will receive the crown of life which the Lord has promised to those who love him. One of the observations that gets made about the book of James is that it is the Proverbs of the New Testament. And the reason people give it that description is because it seems to jump from subject to subject, one verse to the next, and feels disconnected even some, as you feel like, okay, well, here's another subject. Trying to outline the book of James can be very difficult. But in verses 2 and 12, I want to suggest to you that our text this morning holds together. Now, I want to suggest further that the book of James holds together. I don't think it's the Proverbs of the New Testament. I do think he goes in thematic elements, and there are themes that carry all the way through the book. Right here in verse 2, he introduces the subject of trials. In verse 12, he comes right back to it, and I think that suggests that we've been on the subject of trials the whole time. And I want to try to bring that together as we go through this particular passage of James to show that we're looking at a consistent idea all the way from verses 2 to 12. Well, consider it all joy, he says, as I've already suggested. That is a challenging statement. It's not just a bright statement. And it's not also just kind of a ignore what's going on and look on the bright side, keep your chin up, but rather there's really deep thought that must go into to accomplishing what he is setting before us here. To consider it all joy when you encounter various trials. The word various in this passage means variegated. In fact, that's the literal meaning of it is many-colored. And the idea is not quantity of trials so much as variety. That all the different ways trials can come upon you. And boy, we could make a list, couldn't we? And I could tell you about mine, and then you could tell me about yours, and yours would be very different. And we might even sometimes we do get into comparisons about who's had it worse. And I don't know what the answer is. I know I'm probably not at the top of that list. I've had trials. I don't think they compare to some of the worst that I've heard of. And I'm not compared to some of the worst that I've read here. The book of Job probably does fall near the top of that list. And in the midst of his troubles, in Job chapter 5 and verse 7, he says, man is born for trouble as sparks fly upward. That idea of sparks flying upward, there's a couple of notions there. First of all, it happens consistently. You're building a fire. Out at our house, we, with all the storms and rain that have come through, we have a constant fire going, constant brush pile. We see this quite a bit. And so there's a consistency. But I tell you what there also is, it's waves. Is that when the sparks go up, it's usually patterns. And so you get some sparks, and then there's lots of it, and then it'll die down for a little bit, and then there's lots of it. And then that what we talk about with our trials. Well, it comes in waves, doesn't it? And we feel that way. And certainly Job felt that way, the sparks flying upward. We see over in Ecclesiastes chapter 2 and verse 7, in the midst of Solomon's sort of depressing observations about life, he says, so I hated life, for the work which had been done under the sun was grievous to me, because everything is futility and striving after the wind. He is so frustrated at and so unhopeful at what he sees in life. It is so full of misery and distress. So in the face of that notion and that contemplation, James doesn't say, learn to survive trials. Learn to grit your teeth and get through it. He says, consider it joy. It's the very opposite thing that naturally comes to mind when trials come upon us. It's certainly not what came to Job's mind. It's not what came to Solomon's mind. It's not what came to many psalmists' minds. But I want to suggest to you that it is a hard task that he is setting, and it is one that requires a great deal of resolve, as we'll talk about more in just a moment. And it's one that requires a great deal of honesty about our circumstances. We're not talking about avoidance or ignoring the realities. After Vietnam, a man named James Stockdale, who would be familiar to some of you, I'm sure, was interviewed about the prisoner of war realities. And he was talking about, who made it and who didn't make it. And one of the observations that Mr. Stockdale made was that you could tell who would make it and who wouldn't by one particular factor. And it was the optimists in the sense that they just knew any moment their freedom was coming, they weren't going to make it. And it was the ones who looked around and said, we hope to get out of here one day, but right now we got to deal with the realities of the world that we're living in. They were the ones that were going to make it. This quote in his book, it says, you must never confuse faith that you will prevail in the end, which you can never afford to lose, with the discipline to confront the most brutal facts of your current reality, whatever they might be. Brutal facts of the current reality. That is, James is not asking us to ignore those. He wants us to be able to look them squarely in the face, not with grim determination, but with joyful determination. And that is a tall order. So how do we accomplish that? Well, I'll just go ahead and tell you, it's a lot about thought processes. It's a lot about how you think about your trials. And that's what Mr. Stockdale was saying, is he could look and he could see about the way people thought about the difficulty determined whether they were going to make it through the difficulty. And so it is in James's case. He's pointing and he's saying, here's how to think about these things. But note as we go through these, again, it's not about trying to fool ourselves. It is about an honest assessment. So he says it's about knowing what it produces. You consider it all joy or count it all joy, knowing what it produces. Knowing, he says, that the testing of your faith brings about perseverance. And he goes on past that to perfection. So what's being tested here? Well, it's our faith. It is our level of commitment and loyalty and confidence in God and in his Son, Jesus Christ. And it's being tested in multiple ways. So in one sense, we talk about the word test, which is another word for trial. It can be translated in both, and I think test in this instance is a good way to translate that. When you think about a test, you're given a test, we usually think, first of all, primarily in terms of pass-fail. And there is a sense in which you're being tested, pass-fail. Will your faith survive the trial? But the idea here is not put just in terms of pass-fail, but rather it is another way that we use the word test or trial, and that is it is a test that you endure in order to get better. And it's the idea of training, going through tests in training in order to burn off the weaknesses. We talk about that with purifying gold and so forth, elements like that. And I think that particularly is the idea here. It is a test with improvement in mind. And of course, that goes to the idea of who's at the helm of this test. And I think the implication here, and as we get on further, we'll see, is that there's got to be a confidence in the one giving the test, the one supervising the test, and that would be God in this particular case. As far as that confidence goes, that is the rub in a lot of this. And we'll see that as we continue on, as he talks about the confidence, the trust that we need to have without any doubting, he says. When you go and you want to get better, be better at something, and you go and you ask somebody, will you help me be better? If it's athletic competition, then what's probably going to happen is somebody, if they're good at what they do, they're going to say, I can help you, but it's going to be painful. It's going to be very difficult. It's going to require a lot of commitment from you. And what they end up doing is testing your level of commitment. Sometimes our level of commitment doesn't make it past the first bell, as it were. I perhaps have told the story of a brother that came to Brother Waldron and said, could I study with you? And knew the high level of training that Brother Waldron put himself through. And so he said, can I study with you? And he said, I start at 5 a.m. and I won't wait on you. There were people in Brother Waldron's life who did not show up at 5 a.m. or even 5:15 a.m. This fellow showed up at 4:45. He wanted to pass the test. And the rigors that he was put through, he continued to pass. But how does a man or woman put themselves willingly through grueling regimens? Well, they constantly think about what they want to produce, right? They think about the end goal. And so when they're going through extreme pain, I was reading a while back about what a Navy SEAL goes through to be able to have the seal of approval to become a Navy SEAL. It's sadistic. It is overwhelming and something I would never be willing to put myself through, I don't think. Why? They want to be the men who are capable of doing the things that they have to do. And they go through things, unimaginable things we would call torture, because they want it bad enough. And so that idea, that thought process of what it promises to produce. Now, Hebrews chapter 12 makes an observation. He says, the Hebrew writer says in Hebrews 12 and verse 11, all discipline for the moment seems not to be joyful, but sorrowful. So here, James has told us to count it all joy. In Hebrews chapter 12, he says, there's no trial that seems joyful in the moment. But of course, he goes forward. He says it's sorrowful, yet for those who have been trained by it, afterwards it yields the peaceable fruit of righteousness. He does the same thing James does. Look to what it produces. And so when he says it seems not to be joyful, what he's saying is, obviously, in and of itself, nobody's sitting there going through the Navy SEAL training going, this is fun. Man, I love this. They don't love that. They love what it produces. I mean, desperately love it in order to go through this. And the same thing with the athletes. Paul references the athletes in 1 Corinthians chapter 9 there at the end. He says, look at what they do, even then, right? That's not a new thing that athletes put themselves through grueling regimens. Paul points at them and says, look at what they do. He says, I do that so that my soul will be saved. He says, I do that spiritually. I buffet my body. I bring it into subjection so that I will not have run in vain. They do it for a perishable crown. I do it for an imperishable crown. So James points to that and he says, keep that in mind. Don't lose sight of what is being produced. So then he says, let perseverance have its perfect work. Now, this is not a passive word in this instance. The word let throughout the New Testament is an imperative. Andrew's nodding his head over there. He's probably been told that as many times by Tom Holly as I have. Let is a command, right? But it's the idea of you submit to this. Let this happen. Let God's test produce the result. Submit to the process. Now, when we think about that idea of submitting and letting the trial do its work, there's a couple of things I want to note. First of all, this is not to say that we don't do our best to avoid difficulties, right? It's not that you look for the most misery you can find, and boy, you just heap up misery to yourself because then I'll really be able to grow. In 2 Corinthians chapter 12, Paul tells us about his thorn in the flesh. And he says there that his prayer was that God would remove it. And in fact, he tells us, he says, beginning in verse 7, because of the surpassing greatness of the revelations for this reason, to keep me from exalting myself, there was given to me a thorn in the flesh, a messenger of Satan to torment me, to keep me from exalting myself. Concerning this, I pleaded with the Lord 3 times that it might leave me. I'm all for, look, when a trial comes my way, granted, count it all joy, but along with that, I'm going to ask God, is there a way around this? Is there a way we can avoid this? I think we have the example of Jesus himself. Let this cup pass from me. Jesus is not relishing the cross. Even though Paul will recognize what it produces, he doesn't relish the thorn in the flesh. We don't relish trials for their own sake. We only relish them for what they produce. Now, having said that, there are trials that simply must be borne. And so what happens is Paul moves from avoidance, which is natural and even appropriate, over into acceptance, and not just like passive surrender, but rather a very active acceptance of sort of doing battle with the trial. And I don't mean doing battle like he went from praying to God, now I'm going to go talk to the doctors and I'm going to finally get rid of this thorn in the flesh, but doing battle from the mental aspect. Paul began reframing the way he was seeing the thorn in the flesh from something simply to be endured to something to learn from. What can I learn? I can learn humility. And I can learn how much I need God. And that I cannot stand by my own power, but that I must rely on him. And I can learn how he can be glorified in the midst of this. When you think about how people engage with trials, there are a lot of people who might think that they submit to trials. But what they really do is give up to trials. That's not what we're talking about. A lot of people say, look, we're going to have to get through this. What? Yeah, what other choice do I have? It's not what James is talking about here. He's not saying, have that attitude of, yeah, it is what it is. Yes, there are things that cannot be changed. James is talking about dealing with the things that can, which is generally right here and here. How are you meeting the trial? How is it producing anything in you? We have not had the levels of trial and difficulty that other people have. There's been so many just in this congregation over the last few years. And there's trials in your own life. And then, I don't know at this point, but there's trials that are exacerbated when you watch somebody else go through it, particularly your children. Been a lot of that in this congregation. Fresh wounds get opened. And so you see all of these things, and you can have that sense of, yeah, we're going to get through it because we don't have any other choice. And it's easy to go there. For us, our biggest trial of the last 3 years, and frankly of our lives, have involved little man up here. And we have gone through all the, I think, negotiations of figuring out what to do with that. We've absolutely prayed, and I guarantee you a lot more than 3 times, that the difficulties would be taken away. And so have you, and we appreciate it. In negotiating that, one of the ways we've tried to negotiate that very early on is just sort of that confidence, this will soon pass and it'll all be fine. It didn't. It didn't just not pass, it got worse. And if your confidence and if your faith is in that the test is going to be over real quick and after all not so bad, I'm going to tell you, you won't make it. Because when it gets worse, the thing that you placed your faith on is gone. You need something a lot more firm and steady than that good, happy days are just around the corner. They may not be. Now what? So another way that we certainly try to deal with it is we fight it. And I think there's nothing inappropriate about that. We made our pleas. We hired our lawyer and called every single person that we found out anywhere that we could possibly call. The bureaucrats all up the chain who will answer the phone, which is not many of them. And there were days when things got worse and you're taking this little boy you love and you're peeling his hands off of your collar to give him over to somebody that you're terrified to give him over to. You sit in the car, who can I call? And frankly, the list is done. There's nobody. You just have to sit there and drive away. And you've prayed your prayers. And so what feels next is, it is. You just surrender. Another path we tried to take is we're going to wall ourselves off a little bit. And we're just not going to emotionally connect as much. Because if we do, we won't make it if it goes south. We tried that for, a day. You cannot. Because what that does is a couple of things. First of all, you just can't do it. But secondly, what you would do is you would rob somebody else for your own safety. You say, I'm not going to love like I'm supposed to love because then I might get hurt. Yeah. Might get put on a cross. That's what you do. You love to your own hurt. And then after you don't say, I learned my lesson. No, you go right back to it. If you learned your lesson, what you learn is that that's worth something even if you lose it all. So you do it again. So where we had to come to, and I'm not saying we came here cleanly, or that this is a straight progression. It's kind of a roller coaster. Where we got to, I hope, is a little bit of what Paul says here. We had to learn that I cannot without him. And then if I lose everything here, that will not be the thing that my faith was in. When that's all gone, he'll still be there. It's the only thing I got to hold on to. So people coming up and saying, it's going to be okay. That's not helpful. He's going to be okay. I don't know about that. I'm sure the judges have made the right decision. Have you seen some of the decisions judges make? That was no comfort. This was comfort. And the other thing that I had to learn was that trusting in God is not trusting that God will eventually do the thing that you want him to do. Trusting in God is trusting that no matter what he does, he will do right, and he is your God. And he will care for you. And you will not lose anything that you've stored up with him. Matthew chapter 5. Matthew chapter 5 and verse 39. A little bit farther on from the reading that Jacob did for us this morning. Towards the end of chapter 5, beginning in verse 39, after Jesus references the eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. He says, I say to you, do not resist an evil person, but whoever slaps you on your right cheek, turn the other to him also. I believe that this whole passage, as you continue on, and it has to do with the garment that someone might take from you and the service that someone might compel you into, it all has to do with framing of the trial. That when somebody comes and slaps you, here you are, you've been slapped by a Roman soldier, and you know that, there's nothing you can do. You're not even a citizen. You slap him back, that's a death warrant. What do? What you do is, instead of thinking about that as the thing you can do nothing about, what can I do? I can't do anything about it. You can do something. You can think that what he's just done is harmed my pride. And you can think, I didn't want my pride harmed, I wanted it crucified. And you can look your oppressor in the face and say to him, I could use one more dose of that. Would you slap me on the other cheek? And what you've done by thinking about it in those terms, by finding advantage from the oppression, is you've turned it around in a way that he cannot oppress you. What must it feel like for the soldier who's come to embarrass and shame you, and you say, man, I want to do away. I want to be shamed and brought low. It must be so confusing for the soldier. What do I do now? You can do nothing. To the man who finds joy in trial. And you can only find joy in trial when you realize what God is producing. You're working with him. It's not surrender, but it is submission. Well, that brings us to our next point, which is what he says in verses 5 through 8. But if any of you lacks wisdom, let him ask of God, who gives to all generously and without reproach, and it will be given to him. But he must ask in faith, doubting nothing. So first of all, the wisdom that is being asked here. It is the wisdom of God's word. And understand that's how you get wisdom. It is not saying, you ask God to divinely implant something in you. This is like, when you take Jesus' prayer in Matthew chapter 6, give us this day our daily bread, and then you take another passage, if a man shall not work, neither shall he eat. you combine those. You understand that when Jesus is saying, give us this day, he doesn't mean I'm going to sit back on my couch and wait for you to plop it in my lap. As we go about working to gain our daily bread, reward us with it, please, Lord. And as we go about striving to gain the wisdom that God has already made available, we pray to him that he would bless us with a return for our efforts. But what about this no doubting? Well, here's the problem. God's wisdom, it does not sound, well, first of all, it doesn't sound like what we want to hear. It can sound the very opposite of what we want to hear sometimes. That's what 1 Corinthians chapter 2 and verse 14 tells us. 1 Corinthians 2 and in verse 14, where Paul says, a natural man does not accept the things of the Spirit of God, for they are foolishness to him. He cannot understand them because they are spiritually appraised. You're going through something. I mean, imagine somebody playing out Jesus' scenario in Matthew chapter 5 and telling a Roman soldier to give him another slap on the other cheek. And everybody, you are bonkers. You've lost your mind. And he hasn't. He's the one that hasn't lost his mind. You think the person who goes home seething and raging with bitterness and impotence is in a better place than that guy? But it doesn't feel like it, does it? It feels like that's insanity. It's foolishness. But I want to tell you, you climb up to the highest echelons of academia, our ivory towers set on the highest hills, right? The people with the most degrees who can talk about these things from a philosophical level, and you say, what's going on? And they say nothing, and it has no purpose, and all of it is chance molecules banging against each other. Why don't you rub that on your wound and see how much help that gives you? Bottom line is God's got an answer. And it's an answer that may not be precisely what we want in the moment, but it's going to get us somewhere. Their answer literally takes you nowhere. And so God says, come. You want to get through these trials? Come ask me for wisdom. But don't come with one foot still out there in the world. Because then you're going to start talking about how my wisdom's silly. It's a crutch for people who just can't get through. That it's not real. What we believe when we go through trials is God's at work. Jeremiah chapter 18, Jeremiah's told to go to the house of the potter, and he's watching the potter work. And what it is he's watching God work, and God says, I'm fashioning, I'm making things. And it's your reaction to his fashioning that determines what he makes of you. That's what Jeremiah chapter 18 tells us. But at the end, it's, we're going to do what we're going to do. We are who we are. Guess what? That's what the atheists say. We simply are what we are. Free will is an illusion. You don't have choices about these things. But 1 Corinthians chapter 10 and verse 13, it warns us against thinking that we are being put to test that we cannot endure, that we are being tempted in ways that no man can endure. He says, no temptation has overtaken you except as such as is common to man. But God is faithful. He's faithful, and he will make a way of escape. We see that play out in the case of Job. We see the restraints that God puts on Satan as he tempts Job. And we take solace in that. Even though he gives him a long leash, he's still on a leash. And it's still God directing the whole thing. You have confidence in me, he says. So, when you think about God's word, it's one thing to be uncertain about what a passage means as we're thinking on his wisdom and applying it. It's another thing to be uncertain about whether or not it's true. I know God's word's true, even the parts I don't know what they mean. I have confidence in him. And I trust in him and his wisdom. So, don't doubt. Psalm 37, verse 1. Do not fret because of evildoers. Be not envious toward wrongdoers, for they will wither quickly like the grass and fade like the green herb. Trust in the Lord and do good. Dwell in the land and cultivate faithfulness. Delight yourself in the Lord, and he will give you the desires of your heart. Commit your way to the Lord. Trust also in him, and he will do it. He will bring forth your righteousness as the light and your judgment as the noonday. Rest in the Lord and wait patiently for him. Do not fret because of him who prospers in his way, because of the man who carries out wicked schemes. A lot of things that he brings up there that are going to cause you to doubt. He says, don't. Keep trusting. And you wait as long as it takes, with confidence that he will come through. And if you don't, let me just say, he says, you're tossed to and fro. You just might as well not. Make up your mind. Do you believe and trust in him, or don't you? Finally, coming back to James 1, we come down to verses 9 through 10. And again, here's one of those sections where it feels like we just take a detour. But the brother of humble circumstances, he says, is to boast. I think one of the things that might help us if we think of that boasting in terms of the expression of the joy that he opened up with. Count it all joy. Boasting is not the same word, but it's certainly, in this case, the same idea, right? It's the idea of you go around expressing joy at your circumstances. What circumstances? It looks like you got nothing. But the poor man who's found Christ says, you got it all wrong. I got everything. I live in the house of the King. And I have his blessing. I've been adopted by him into his family. Poverty is one form of trial. And it's the kind of trial that is a state. And in that state, he says, you keep your mindset here. On the converse, the brother of the rich man is to boast in his humiliation. And so we're back there, even, I think, more clearly into verse 2. Here you have a man who's supposed to boast in, he's in the midst of trials, and yet he's supposed to walk around looking as if he's got the whole world in his hands, because he does. But here's a man who goes around with his wealth, and he's supposed to find glory when he is brought low. And I think the idea is, make sure when you're the rich man that you don't find confidences and joy in your good times, because that'll go away. You see, it's not, it'll all work out. Find joy in those moments where you have an opportunity to be brought low and say, like the apostles in Acts chapter 5, that we are considered worthy. Now, which of those two do you think we most often need to hear? Is that we glory in our humble circumstances, or that we need to find boasting when we are humbled from high circumstances? Well, I'd say the latter is most often what we find ourselves in. But what do? Every time that we falter a little bit from our acclimated circumstances, do we glory? Do we boast and say, what a great opportunity for me to show that my confidence is not in these things, but in the God whom I serve? No, we say, can you believe that the internet is down? And I know that's such a small humility. That's the point. We don't even deal well with small humilities, much less great ones. Our whole country suffered a great humiliation. Well, there's many, but at least the one everybody's aware of is we all had to lock ourselves in our houses. And we went through a period of frankly exposing that we don't know near as much as we think we know. And what's the result? fighting and division that has risen to a level that is not unheard of in history, actually. But maybe we hadn't heard in a while. Do we rise to the occasion as a people? I hope we do as Christians. Maybe the world doesn't. It exposes the world for what the world is, but it should expose Christians for who Christians are. That we're people who don't get brought low by those things. We get brought closer to God, which is right back to our first point. That's why we rejoice. Because I'll rejoice in anything that gets me closer to Him. I love the song Brent was supposed to lead. Alan led for us a few moments ago. May this journey bring a blessing. But at the end of each verse, with your likeness. That's the idea. And it's not. Sometimes you think about that song as talking about when we die. It's not. It's talking about when you get to the other side of a trial. And what he's doing in that song is pointing forward and saying, here, I'm going to get all the treasure I can out of this. And I'm going to bring it in the end right before your throne because I got it from you. And I want to look more like you when it's all done. What a sad thing is at the end of the trial if we look just more like the world. We failed. And I want to tell you what, there's no joy there. And you won't find joy in trials. And you won't see any good in it because frankly, there's not. It was a trial that destroyed instead of a trial that produced improvement. So we want to see it as trials that bring us to verse 12. The one who perseveres, who's been approved, who received the crown of life, which the Lord has promised to those who love him. And what will we do with those crowns? Revelation chapter 4 seems to indicate we'll throw them at his throne. Just like that song we were singing about. I know if you're here this morning, you've got trials. Everybody does. You want a way to deal with them? World's got a lot of options. All of them fall flat at some point. They will all end up empty, like sawdust in your mouth. But here is one that is lasting and sure and certain. And no matter what else the world is doing to get through their days, you will have something that will get you through your whole life. If you're here this morning, you've not put your confidence in him, but you would like to or would like to even talk about that, please let us know. And if you'd like to do so while we stand and sing, we invite you to come.